If you're going to question me in my own club, Claire, maybe you shouldn't be here at all, Harold Bennett said on his 74th birthday, his voice sharp enough to silence the entire dining room. The chandeliers above the country club ballroom glowed against polished marble floors, and a three-tier cake sat untouched at the center of the long white tablecloth. But no one was looking at the cake anymore. They were watching Claire Bennett stand very still beside her father's chair, her champagne glass resting lightly between her fingers, her expression unreadable. A moment earlier she had asked a simple question about the updated trust documents Daniel had mentioned in passing, and the air had shifted as if someone had opened a window in midwinter. Harold's jaw tightened, and in a sudden gesture that felt more like dismissal than anything else, he brushed her aside and told her not to embarrass him in front of guests. Claire did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She set her glass down on the table with deliberate calm and stepped back, smoothing the sleeve of her navy dress as whispers rippled across the room. Daniel, standing to Harold's right in a tailored gray suit, placed a steadying hand on the older man's shoulder and offered a sympathetic smile to the guests, as if the tension had been nothing more than a misunderstanding. Claire noticed the way Daniel's eyes flicked toward the head table where the family attorney had been seated earlier, and something inside her settled into a colder place. 2 nights before the party, Claire had opened an envelope that arrived by certified mail, a routine statement from the brokerage firm her mother had trusted for decades. The numbers were wrong. A substantial portion of the Bennett family holdings had been reallocated into a new entity she did not recognize, and the listed beneficiary had changed. When she asked Harold about it over coffee the following morning in his sunlit kitchen, he brushed her off, claiming it was just estate planning and that she worried too much. Yet she had seen the way Daniel answered questions before Harold could, the way he referenced meetings Claire had never been invited to attend. Now, in the echoing ballroom with waitstaff frozen mid-step and relatives pretending to study their napkins, Claire felt the weight of every quiet conversation she had overheard in the past month. Harold lifted his fork and resumed cutting into his steak as though nothing unusual had happened, and gradually the guests followed his lead, laughter returning in careful increments. Claire remained where she was for a moment longer, absorbing the scene. The gold 74 balloons tied near the bar, the framed photographs of Harold's business milestones arranged near the entrance, the applause that had greeted him when he first walked in. She realized that the celebration was not just about a birthday. It was about control, about legacy, about who would shape the Bennett name after Harold could no longer do it himself. Without another word, Claire picked up her purse and walked toward the exit, heels clicking softly against the polished floor. No one tried to stop her. Daniel's voice rose behind her, smoothly proposing a toast to Harold's continued leadership and family unity, and the room responded with obedient clinks of glass. Claire stepped outside into the cool evening air, the distant hum of traffic along the highway blending with the muffled music inside. She did not cry. She did not look back. As she reached her car, she took out her phone and opened the folder of scanned statements and emails she had saved over the past week. 2 weeks later, in a quiet courtroom across town, a judge would review those same documents line by line, and the celebration Harold had so carefully orchestrated would begin to unravel in a way no toast could repair. 48 hours before the birthday dinner, Claire Bennett had been standing alone in her kitchen with a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands, staring at a stack of financial statements spread across the granite countertop. The morning light filtered through half-drawn blinds, casting narrow stripes across numbers that no longer made sense. For more than 30 years, her mother had managed those accounts with careful discipline, tracking every dividend and every transfer in neat handwriting before eventually moving everything online. After her mother passed away, Claire had continued reviewing the summaries once a quarter, not because she doubted her father, but because it felt like a quiet way to honor the structure her parents had built together. That particular Tuesday, however, the brokerage statement showed a new limited liability company listed as the primary holding entity for nearly 40% of the Bennett portfolio. The mailing address was a post office box she did not recognize, and the authorized contact was not Harold Bennett. It was Daniel Bennett. Claire read the line twice, then a third time, convincing herself she was misinterpreting standard estate planning language. Yet when she logged into the online portal and downloaded the transaction history, She saw a series of transfers totaling several $1 million moved in increments over the previous 6 weeks. None of those transfers had triggered a notification to her, even though she was still listed as a secondary contact on the account. She remembered how Daniel had begun attending Harold's meetings last fall, offering to help manage scheduling and correspondence after Harold mentioned feeling overwhelmed. At the time, Claire had been grateful someone was assisting her father with daily tasks. Now she replayed small details in her mind, like the afternoon Daniel answered Harold's phone and said they were in the middle of something important, or the evening Harold abruptly canceled their usual Sunday dinner because he had a private consultation. Claire folded the papers carefully and placed them in a manila envelope before driving across town to visit her father in person. Harold greeted her in his bright, recently renovated kitchen, where new stainless steel appliances gleamed under recessed lighting. He seemed relaxed, almost distracted, talking about menu selections for the upcoming celebration at the country club. When Claire gently asked about the new holding company, Harold waved his hand as though swatting away a minor annoyance, and said that Daniel had recommended restructuring to minimize tax exposure and streamline succession planning. He insisted everything was under control and that she did not need to worry about details. Claire noticed that Harold did not meet her eyes when he spoke, and that Daniel, seated at the breakfast bar with a tablet open in front of him, offered to email her a summary later. The summary never arrived. That evening, back in her own home, Claire opened a secure folder on her laptop and began saving copies of every document she could access. She contacted the brokerage firm's compliance department to request clarification on notification procedures and learned that beneficiary designations had been updated with an electronic signature attributed to Harold. The timestamp showed it was executed late at night on a date Claire distinctly remembered her father complaining about insomnia. She sat at her dining table. Long after midnight, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house, realizing that what had once been a simple family structure was becoming something far more complicated, and that the celebration plan for the weekend might be masking decisions that would affect the Bennett legacy for generations. The morning after the birthday dinner, Claire Bennett did not return to the country club or call any of the relatives who had witnessed the tension. Instead, she drove to a modest brick office building on the east side of town where the Bennett family accountant had worked for nearly 20 years. Thomas Green had retired the previous winter, but his name was still listed on the directory in faded gold lettering. Claire had tracked down his personal number through an old holiday card her mother had kept in a drawer, and when she called, he sounded surprised but not entirely shocked to hear from her. They agreed to meet at a small diner off Route 17, a place with vinyl booths and the scent of fresh coffee lingering in the air. Thomas arrived with a worn leather briefcase and the cautious expression of someone who had already guessed the subject of the conversation. Claire slid a copy of the brokerage statement across the table without preamble. Thomas adjusted his glasses and read slowly, his finger tracing each line. He did not speak for nearly a full minute. Finally, he exhaled and asked when she had first noticed the transfers. Claire explained the timeline, the new limited liability company, the updated beneficiary designation, and Daniel's increasing presence in financial discussions. Thomas listened carefully, then admitted that shortly before his retirement, Harold had requested access credentials be consolidated under a new administrative contact. At the time, Thomas assumed it was part of succession planning, but he had recommended that any restructuring be reviewed by independent counsel. He had not been included in the final meetings. Claire felt the weight of his words settle over the table between them. Thomas went on to explain that electronic signatures could be legally binding, but they required clear documentation of intent and proper oversight. If Harold had authorized everything knowingly, the transfers might stand. If there was evidence of undue influence or procedural irregularities, the situation could be different. Claire asked him directly whether the pattern of transfers looked typical for someone restructuring a family estate. Thomas shook his head slowly and said that the staggered amounts and the creation of a separate holding company under Daniel's name suggested a shift in control rather than a simple tax adjustment. He advised her to gather every communication she could find, including emails, meeting notes, and any records showing changes to account access. Claire thanked him and paid the bill before stepping back into the parking lot, where the afternoon sun reflected off windshields in sharp flashes of light. She sat in her car for several minutes, reviewing the quiet progression of events in her mind. Daniel offering to help, Harold canceling long-standing routines, passwords changing without notice, conversations redirected whenever she asked direct questions. None of it had felt urgent at the time. Together, it formed a pattern she could no longer ignore. That evening, Claire contacted an attorney who specialized in fiduciary disputes and elder financial protection. She did not accuse anyone. She did not make dramatic statements. She simply scheduled a consultation and began organizing her documents in chronological order. In a folder labeled Bennett Estate, she placed copies of the statements, screenshots of the electronic signatures, and a list of dates when significant decisions had been made. Outside her window, the neighborhood was quiet. Children riding bicycles along the sidewalk and sprinklers ticking rhythmically across front lawns. Inside, Claire understood that the next steps would require patience and precision. What had once been a family matter was becoming a legal one, and she intended to move forward carefully, one documented fact at a time. 2 days after meeting with the attorney, Claire Bennett sat across from Laura Mitchell in a quiet conference room overlooking downtown, the city skyline framed by tall windows and early afternoon light. Laura specialized in fiduciary disputes and elder financial protection, and she listened without interruption as Claire laid out the timeline in measured detail. The manila folder rested between them, organized with tabs marking each transfer, each updated designation, each instance where Daniel had inserted himself into decisions that once belonged solely to Harold. Claire did not exaggerate. She did not speculate. She described the new limited liability company, the electronic signature executed near midnight, the gradual consolidation of account access under Daniel's administrative credentials. Laura reviewed the documents carefully, occasionally jotting notes in the margin of a yellow legal pad. When she finished, she asked one question that lingered in the air longer than the rest. Had Harold shown any recent signs of cognitive decline, even subtle ones? Claire hesitated before answering. Over the past year, her father had repeated stories more often, misplaced documents he once guarded meticulously, and grown unusually defensive when pressed for clarification. None of those changes alone had alarmed her. Together, they formed a pattern that now felt impossible to dismiss. Laura explained that in cases involving large estates and sudden shifts in control, courts often examined whether undue influence or diminished capacity played a role. If Daniel had isolated Harold from long-standing advisors, restricted communication, or facilitated late-night document execution without independent review, those details could matter significantly. Claire listened in silence, the steady hum of traffic 12 stories below providing a distant backdrop. She thought about her mother's handwritten ledgers, the careful way she had balanced growth with caution, and how fiercely she had protected the integrity of the family business. This was never only about money. It was about stewardship. Laura outlined the next steps with clinical precision. Request full audit trails from the brokerage firm. Subpoena internal communications if necessary. Petition the court for a temporary freeze on substantial transfers pending review. Claire understood that such action would escalate the situation beyond private discussion. It would draw scrutiny. It would create public record. Yet she also understood that waiting could allow further assets to move beyond easy recovery. When the meeting ended, Claire stepped into the elevator holding a copy of the proposed petition. She read the header twice. Petition for temporary protective order and review of fiduciary conduct. The language was formal, restrained, and deliberate, much like the approach she intended to take. That evening, she drove past her father's house on the way home. The porch lights were on, and she could see silhouettes moving inside through the front windows. She wondered if Harold realized how far the decisions of the past few weeks had shifted the foundation beneath him. She did not call. She did not send a message. Instead, she returned home and signed the engagement agreement with Laura electronically, authorizing her to proceed. In a quiet suburban neighborhood where sprinklers ticked across neatly trimmed lawns and neighbors waved casually from driveways, Claire initiated a legal process that would soon bring the Bennett estate under the careful review of a judge, and once that process began, it would not be easily reversed. The petition was filed on a Thursday morning at 9:14, electronically stamped by the county clerk before most of the city had finished its first cup of coffee. Claire Bennett received the confirmation notice on her phone, while sitting at her dining table, the same table where her mother had once sorted invoices and signed payroll checks by hand. She stared at the subject line for several seconds before opening it. Petition accepted. Hearing date scheduled. The court had set a preliminary review for the following week. It was sooner than she expected. Laura Mitchell called within the hour to explain the next phase. The brokerage firm had been formally notified to preserve all records related to the Bennett accounts, including internal communications and access logs. A temporary hold would be requested on any additional transfers exceeding $50,000 until the court could assess the circumstances. Claire listened carefully, writing down dates and instructions in a legal pad she had reserved specifically for this process. Later that afternoon, she received an email from the brokerage compliance department acknowledging the inquiry and confirming that recent administrative changes would be examined. The tone was neutral, procedural, but the subtext was clear. The matter was no longer private. Word traveled quickly. By early evening, Daniel called. His voice was controlled, almost polite, as he asked why compliance officers were requesting clarification on his authority within the Bennett holding structure. Claire did not accuse him of wrongdoing. She simply stated that, as a beneficiary and long-standing secondary contact, she had exercised her right to seek transparency. Daniel responded that Harold had made his wishes clear and that outside interference would only complicate matters. Claire thanked him for his perspective and ended the call without raising her voice. 30 minutes later, Harold left a message that was more strained than angry. He asked why lawyers were involved and said that family concerns should be handled within the family. Claire replayed the message once, then saved it in a digital folder labeled correspondence. She understood that every interaction now carried weight. The next morning, a process server delivered official notice to Harold's residence. Claire did not witness the exchange, but she imagined the envelope being handed over, the formal language outlining a hearing to review fiduciary conduct and asset transfers. By noon, Laura forwarded an initial audit summary prepared by a forensic accountant. It highlighted irregular timing patterns in electronic signatures and noted that several large transfers occurred within minutes of one another, all routed through a device registered under Daniel's email address. None of the findings constituted a final conclusion, but together they formed a narrative that required explanation. As dusk settled over the neighborhood, Claire stood by her living room window watching the streetlights flicker on. She felt no satisfaction, only a steady sense of inevitability. The process she had initiated was not driven by anger. It was driven by documentation. In less than a week, a judge would examine the same timestamps, the same beneficiary changes, the same consolidated access privileges. Until then, Claire continued to organize her files, respond to attorney emails, and prepare for questions she knew would come. The celebration at the country club had been loud and polished. What followed now was quiet and procedural, unfolding not with applause, but with stamped pages and scheduled hearings that would determine who truly controlled the Bennett legacy. The hearing was scheduled for 10:30 on a Wednesday morning, and Claire Bennett arrived at the courthouse 20 minutes early, dressed in a charcoal suit that conveyed restraint rather than defiance. The building itself was unremarkable, a rectangular structure of pale stone with metal detectors at the entrance and rows of wooden benches lining the main corridor. Inside Courtroom 3, the atmosphere was quiet and procedural, more subdued than the polished energy of the country club only weeks earlier. Harold Bennett entered with Daniel at his side, both men dressed formally, both carrying expressions carefully arranged to project composure. Harold avoided looking directly at Claire. Daniel glanced at her briefly, then focused on his phone before slipping it into his jacket pocket. When the clerk called the case, the room settled into attentive silence. Laura Mitchell rose first, outlining the sequence of events with measured clarity. The formation of the limited liability company, the transfer of nearly 40% of the Bennett portfolio, the consolidation of administrative control under Daniel's credentials, and the late-night electronic signatures executed without independent review. She did not speculate about motives. She referenced dates, amounts, and device registrations. The forensic accountant's preliminary summary was entered into the record, highlighting the timing patterns that suggested coordinated action. Daniel's attorney responded by emphasizing Harold's right to manage his own estate and characterizing the restructuring as proactive planning. Harold himself was invited to speak. His voice carried a trace of irritation as he insisted that he was fully capable of making decisions and that Daniel had merely assisted with paperwork. The judge listened without interruption, occasionally asking direct questions about the process used to execute the electronic documents and whether any neutral advisor had been present. When Harold hesitated over specific dates, Daniel attempted to answer, but the judge redirected the question back to Harold. The pause that followed was brief but noticeable. Claire remained still at the counsel table, her hands folded over a legal pad, her expression composed. She was not there to confront. She was there to document. After reviewing the submitted materials, the judge announced that, pending a full evidentiary hearing, a temporary protective order would be issued. All substantial transfers exceeding $50,000 were to be suspended. The brokerage firm was directed to maintain current balances and provide a complete audit trail within 7 business days. Additionally, an independent cognitive assessment of Harold would be scheduled to determine capacity regarding recent financial decisions. The language was formal and even-toned, but its implications were significant. Control over the estate was no longer absolute. As the gavel struck lightly against the block, the room exhaled in collective restraint. Harold's shoulders stiffened. Daniel leaned toward his attorney, whispering rapidly. Claire did not look at either of them. She gathered her folders slowly, aware that the process had only begun. Outside, the late morning sun reflected off parked cars and courthouse windows. Reporters were absent. There was no audience beyond a handful of observers waiting for their own cases to be called. Yet within the quiet structure of that courtroom, the narrative of authority had shifted. What had been presented as private family management was now subject to judicial oversight. Claire stepped down the courthouse steps without haste, the echo of the judge's directive steady in her mind. 2 weeks earlier, she had walked out of a ballroom under chandeliers and applause. Today, she walked into open daylight under the weight of legal restraint, knowing that the next phase would unfold not in whispers or celebrations, but in documented findings and sworn testimony. The week following the preliminary hearing unfolded with a controlled intensity that settled quietly over the Bennett family like a tightening thread. Claire Bennett maintained her regular routine, arriving at her office by 8:30 each morning, reviewing contracts, attending meetings, and answering emails with the same measured tone she had always used. To anyone watching from the outside, nothing appeared different. Yet beneath that steady exterior, she was tracking each development with deliberate focus. The brokerage firm delivered the first segment of the requested audit trail 3 business days after the court order, a secured digital file containing time-stamped access logs and authorization records. Laura Mitchell forwarded the documents with a brief note advising careful review. Claire waited until evening to open the file, preferring the quiet of her living room to the fluorescent lighting of her office. As she scrolled through the data, patterns began to emerge. Multiple high-value transfers had been initiated within minutes of one another, often between 11:30 at night and 1:15 in the morning. The device identification codes listed in the metadata were consistent, tied to an internet address registered under Daniel's email account. In contrast, Harold's historical transactions over the past decade showed a consistent pattern of weekday activity between 9 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon, usually preceded by communication with Thomas Green or the brokerage advisor. The discrepancy was not dramatic on its own, but when placed side by side, it suggested a shift in behavior that would require explanation. Meanwhile, Harold underwent the court-ordered cognitive assessment at a licensed medical facility on the north side of town. The evaluation was conducted privately, lasting nearly 2 hours, with standardized memory and reasoning tests designed to measure executive function. Claire did not attend. She received confirmation only that the assessment had been completed and that a report would be submitted directly to the court within 5 days. Daniel called again that evening, his tone sharper than before, accusing her of escalating a private disagreement into public scrutiny. Claire responded calmly, reminding him that the matter was now under judicial review and that transparency would ultimately protect everyone involved if the decisions had been appropriate. She ended the conversation without raising her voice. In the days that followed, small signs of strain became visible. The country club postponed an upcoming business luncheon Harold had planned to host. A local investment partner requested clarification regarding the temporary hold on transfers. None of these developments were dramatic, but together they indicated that oversight was no longer theoretical. It was active. Claire continued to compile documentation, cross-referencing timestamps, preserving voicemails, and organizing correspondence in chronological order. She did not speak about the case at social gatherings. She did not defend herself publicly. Her strategy remained consistent. Allow the record to speak. On Friday afternoon, Laura called with an update. The cognitive assessment report had been filed under seal, but would be reviewed by the judge prior to the next hearing. The preliminary indication, Laura said carefully, suggested mild impairment affecting complex financial decision-making. Claire absorbed the information in silence, aware that the words carried both legal and personal weight. This was no longer solely about disputed transfers. It was about capacity, influence, and responsibility. As the sun set behind rows of suburban rooftops, Claire stood in her kitchen, the same place where she had first noticed the irregular numbers. She felt no triumph, only clarity. The process was unfolding as it should, methodically and without spectacle. Whatever the court ultimately decided, it would be grounded in documented fact rather than assumption. And in that quiet certainty, Claire found a steadiness that no celebration or confrontation could disrupt. The second hearing was scheduled exactly 14 days after the birthday dinner at the country club, and by then the atmosphere surrounding the Bennett estate had shifted from quiet tension to measured scrutiny. Claire Bennett arrived once again before the courtroom doors opened, carrying a structured binder that now held certified audit trails, email correspondences, device identification logs, and the sealed summary of Harold's cognitive evaluation that had been partially disclosed to counsel. The hallway outside courtroom 3 was busier than before, attorneys moving between chambers, clerks balancing folders, the low hum of procedural life continuing without drama. Harold entered with slower steps this time, his posture upright but less assured, while Daniel remained at his side, his expression fixed in careful neutrality. When the session began, Judge Eleanor Hayes reviewed the submitted findings with precise attention. The forensic accountant testified first, outlining how the electronic transfers had been executed in clustered intervals late at night, using administrative credentials that bypass standard dual notification safeguards previously attached to the accounts. He explained that the restructured limited liability company effectively consolidated voting control and asset management authority under Daniel's oversight, reducing Claire's oversight rights to passive beneficiary status. Daniel's attorney argued that the changes reflected modernization and streamlining, not misconduct. However, when asked to clarify why long-standing compliance alerts had been disabled during the transfer period, no clear documentation was produced. The cognitive assessment report was then summarized for the record. The licensed evaluator concluded that Harold demonstrated mild but measurable impairment in complex financial reasoning, particularly when presented with layered transactional structures and rapid decision sequences. The report did not declare him incapable of managing personal affairs, but it emphasized heightened vulnerability to persuasive influence during high-stakes restructuring. Harold listened quietly as the language was read into the transcript, his expression tightening only slightly. Claire remained composed, her attention fixed on the judge rather than on Daniel. Judge Hayes paused before delivering her interim ruling. She acknowledged Harold's lifetime of business leadership and his right to participate in decisions affecting his estate. At the same time, she emphasized the court's obligation to prevent potential exploitation when significant irregularities coincided with documented cognitive decline. Effective immediately, the court expanded the temporary protective order into a supervised financial oversight arrangement. An independent fiduciary would be appointed to review all major asset transactions. Administrative access credentials would be restored to dual authorization status, requiring oversight beyond Daniel's unilateral control. All pending transfers would remain suspended until further review. The language was calm and deliberate, yet its impact was unmistakable. Daniel's authority over the restructured entity was no longer absolute. Harold exhaled slowly, as though absorbing the weight of oversight that had once seemed unnecessary. There was no raised voice, no spectacle, only the quiet recalibration of control within the boundaries of law. When the gavel sounded, the The courtroom shifted back into motion, attorneys gathering papers, observers stepping into the corridor. Claire closed her binder carefully, aware that the most decisive changes rarely arrived with applause. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps. 2 weeks earlier, a public celebration had projected confidence and dominance. Now, under judicial supervision, the Bennett estate stood in a different light, measured not by speeches or appearances, but by documented authority placed firmly beyond the reach of any single hand. The appointment of the independent fiduciary took effect within 48 hours of the court's expanded order, and the first formal review meeting was scheduled for the following Monday morning at a neutral conference center downtown. Claire Bennett arrived early once again, carrying only a slim portfolio this time, aware that the process had shifted from accusation to oversight. The fiduciary, Margaret Collins, was a certified professional with more than 20 years of experience managing contested estates. Her presence was neither confrontational nor sympathetic. It was administrative. Harold Bennett entered the room with a measured step, Daniel following close behind, both men greeted by the quiet professionalism of structured protocol. Margaret began by outlining her mandate in clear terms. All significant transactions above $50,000 would require dual verification. Existing holdings would be reconciled against the audit trail provided by the brokerage firm. Any changes executed during the period under review would be evaluated for compliance with fiduciary standards. She emphasized that her role was not to assign blame, but to ensure proper stewardship moving forward. The language was clinical, almost detached, yet its implications were unmistakable. Daniel attempted to assert that the restructuring had been intended to simplify succession planning, but Margaret requested documentation supporting the tax analysis and independent advisement cited in earlier filings. When no external advisory memorandum could be produced, she noted the omission without commentary and moved on. Harold listened as Margaret reviewed a side-by-side comparison of transaction patterns spanning 10 years. The contrast was visible even in summary form. For decades, Harold had relied on scheduled quarterly reviews with third-party oversight. In the recent 6-week window, transfers had been accelerated, centralized, and executed during unconventional hours. Margaret asked Harold directly whether he had independently reviewed each document prior to electronic authorization. He hesitated before responding that Daniel had prepared summaries and assured him the changes were routine. The room remained silent for a moment that felt longer than it was. Claire observed without interruption, her focus steady. The process no longer depended on her interpretation. It depended on recorded fact. Margaret concluded the meeting by confirming that, pending final court determination, the Bennett estate would operate under supervised structure. Access credentials would be redistributed to ensure transparency. A formal inventory of all current holdings would be completed within 7 business days. As the meeting adjourned, Harold appeared less defensive and more contemplative, as though the framework of oversight had introduced a reality he had not fully anticipated. Daniel gathered his papers quickly, his expression controlled but strained. Claire stepped into the hallway with the quiet awareness that the center of authority had shifted once more, not dramatically, but permanently. The estate that had once operated under singular command now functioned within shared review. There was no applause, no public spectacle, only procedural recalibration unfolding in conference rooms and court dockets. In that steady recalibration, the foundation of the Bennett legacy was being rewritten, not through confrontation, but through documentation, structure, and the measured application of law. The supervised structure began producing measurable results within days of Margaret Collins assuming fiduciary oversight. The full asset inventory was completed ahead of schedule, and the reconciliation report revealed additional details that had not surfaced during the initial audit. Several subsidiary accounts connected to the limited liability company were found to have been opened with expedited approval, bypassing the layered compliance review that had traditionally governed Bennett transactions. While no funds had permanently disappeared, the restructuring had temporarily obscured the true distribution of control, concentrating operational authority in a way that no prior estate document had authorized. Margaret prepared a comprehensive summary for submission to the court, outlining the timeline of administrative changes, the absence of independent advisory confirmation, and the cognitive assessment findings that underscored Harold Bennett's vulnerability during complex financial decision-making. Claire Bennett reviewed the draft only for factual accuracy, making no editorial suggestions. The record, she believed, needed no embellishment. Meanwhile, the social landscape around Harold shifted subtly. Invitations to speak at regional investment forums were postponed. A longtime banking partner requested clarification regarding the estate's governance status. None of these responses were overtly critical, yet they reflected the reality that external stakeholders were now aware of judicial supervision. Daniel attempted to counterbalance the narrative by contacting business associates directly, emphasizing that the restructuring had been misunderstood. However, the presence of an independent fiduciary limited his influence. Each proposed transaction required documentation, each account access required traceable authorization. The pace of activity slowed to a measured cadence that mirrored the cautious approach Margaret insisted upon. A final status conference was scheduled to determine whether the protective order should remain in effect or transition into a more permanent guardianship arrangement over specific financial domains. On the morning of that conference, the courtroom atmosphere carried a different tone than the earlier hearings. There was less tension and more clarity. Judge Eleanor Hayes reviewed Margaret's findings in open session, noting that while Harold retained general cognitive awareness, the pattern of accelerated restructuring combined with reduced safeguards created conditions inconsistent with prudent fiduciary practice. Daniel's attorney argued that no irreversible harm had occurred. The judge acknowledged that fact, but emphasized that the absence of completed damage did not negate the presence of undue risk. Claire sat quietly as the discussion unfolded, aware that the case had evolved beyond a dispute between family members. It had become a question of stewardship standards and accountability. After brief deliberation, the judge announced that supervisory oversight would remain in place for a defined period of 12 months, during which all significant financial decisions would require independent review. Additionally, administrative control of the limited liability company would be transferred from Daniel to a court-appointed financial administrator until compliance protocols were fully restored. The decision was delivered in calm, even language, yet its impact was decisive. Authority over the estate was no longer concentrated in private hands. It operated under structured governance, transparent and documented. As the gavel sounded once more, Harold lowered his gaze, absorbing the recalibrated boundaries of his authority. Claire gathered her papers without expression. The transformation had not arrived through confrontation or spectacle. It had arrived through documented process, methodical review, and the steady application of oversight that ensured the Bennett legacy would move forward under safeguards stronger than any single voice in a crowded ballroom. The months that followed unfolded with a steadiness that felt almost unfamiliar to the Bennett family. Under the court's directive, Margaret Collins maintained structured oversight, reviewing quarterly statements, approving major transactions, and ensuring that dual authorization protocols remained active across every primary and subsidiary account. The estate's operations slowed, but they stabilized. Investments were evaluated through documented analysis rather than hurried persuasion. Meetings once held privately at Harold's dining table were now conducted in conference rooms with recorded minutes and formal agendas. Claire Bennett attended only when required, choosing not to dominate discussions but to observe compliance. She understood that the objective had never been to remove her father from his legacy. It had been to protect the framework that sustained it. Harold Bennett adapted gradually to the new structure. At first, the presence of oversight had unsettled him. He had built his reputation on decisive action and confident leadership, and the requirement to submit proposals for independent review felt restrictive. Yet over time, the rhythm of accountability replaced the urgency that had defined the 6-week restructuring period. Margaret ensured that Harold retained dignity within the process, inviting his input, clarifying legal boundaries, and distinguishing between prudent planning and concentrated control. Daniel's influence diminished without dramatic confrontation. His administrative credentials remained limited to defined functions, and every recommendation he offered required documented justification. The informal authority he once exercised quietly receded under structured governance. Outside observers began adjusting their perceptions as well. Financial partners resumed routine communication once transparency protocols were verified. The country club reinstated Harold's membership privileges without comment. Business associates referenced the oversight as a temporary recalibration rather than a scandal. The estate's net value remained intact, preserved not by confrontation, but by procedural guardrails that prevented unilateral shifts. For Claire, the transformation carried a quieter significance. She noticed that her conversations with Harold regained a measure of normalcy, though they were never quite as effortless as before. In one meeting with Margaret present, Harold acknowledged that he had relied heavily on Daniel during a period when complex financial documentation felt overwhelming. He did not frame it as manipulation. He framed it as convenience. Margaret responded by emphasizing that convenience must never override transparency in fiduciary management. The statement lingered in the room without accusation. 12 months would determine whether full independent oversight remained necessary. Until then, the estate functioned within defined boundaries that no single individual could override. Claire did not celebrate the outcome. She did not speak about victory. She continued to attend hearings when required and reviewed reports when forwarded. The legacy her parents built remained secure, not because authority had shifted to her, but because authority had been balanced. In the quiet recalibration of power, the Bennett estate found stability. What began with tension beneath chandeliers ended not with spectacle, but with structured continuity, ensuring that decisions affecting generations would rest on documented accountability rather than assumption or unchecked persuasion. A full year passed under structured oversight, and the Bennett estate no longer felt like contested territory. The final review hearing was brief, almost understated compared to the earlier sessions that had reshaped its governance. Margaret Collins submitted her concluding report, confirming that for 12 consecutive months all significant transactions had complied with dual authorization standards. External advisory documentation had been properly archived, and no irregular transfers had occurred. The audit trail reflected a return to deliberate pacing rather than accelerated restructuring. Judge Eleanor Hayes acknowledged the consistency of compliance and announced that formal court supervision would transition into a monitored advisory status rather than direct oversight. The independent fiduciary would remain available in a consultative role, but day-to-day authority would gradually return to Harold Bennett within clearly defined boundaries. The decision was not framed as restoration of dominance. It was framed as restoration of balance. Harold listened carefully as the judge emphasized that continued transparency would preserve both his autonomy and the estate's integrity. Daniel remained present but silent, his influence no longer positioned at the center of decision-making. Claire Bennett observed the exchange without visible emotion, aware that the transformation had never been about removing her father's voice. It had been about preventing any single voice from overriding structural safeguards. When the hearing concluded, Harold approached Claire outside the courtroom. His posture was less rigid than it had been months earlier. He did not offer a dramatic apology or a defensive justification. Instead, he acknowledged that the pace of change had exceeded his comfort and that relying too heavily on convenience had clouded his judgment. Claire responded simply that documentation protects everyone, including him. The conversation was brief and quiet, carried out under the muted hum of courthouse activity. In the weeks that followed, the Bennett estate resumed operations with renewed clarity. Investment meetings included written agendas. Advisory opinions were obtained before structural shifts. Administrative access remained shared rather than centralized. The limited liability company created during the restructuring period was amended to reflect multi-party governance rather than singular control. The legacy Harold and his late wife had built remained intact, not because one person prevailed, but because the system now required accountability. On the anniversary of that birthday dinner at the country club, there was no elaborate celebration. Harold chose instead to host a small luncheon at his home with immediate family. The atmosphere was measured, the conversation steady. There were no grand speeches about authority or succession, only practical discussions about stewardship and long-term planning. Claire stood near the window at one point, watching sunlight stretch across the backyard lawn, and understood that the most decisive shifts in power rarely announce themselves loudly. They unfold through structure, documentation, and the quiet insistence that legacy must be protected by process rather than pride. The Bennett estate had not been taken away. It had been placed within safeguards strong enough to endure beyond any single moment of impulse, ensuring that its future would be defined by accountability, not assumption.